All right, welcome to another episode of Around the County with Supervisor Jim Desmond. I'm Communications Director for District 5. We've got a fantastic guest here today, Dr. Byram Bridle, Associate Professor of Viral Immunology at the University of, how do you pronounce that, Byram?
Guelph.
Guelph? Oh,
yes.
Beautiful. Awesome. For those listening, let's just kind of start here, Doctor. Give us your credentials. I gave it briefly there, but who are you? What do you do?
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm a faculty member and an independent researcher at a university here in Canada, and my areas of expertise overlap with the fields of virology and immunology. And so these, of course, are very relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic because both the problem is at the interface of virology and immunology. And in fact, the COVID-19 disease caused by the SARS coronavirus 2, a lot of the pathogenesis, in fact, in the severe cases is mediated by overly robust immune responses. And then also I'm quite familiar with the primary solution we're all seeking, which is, first of all, I should say it's not vaccination per se, but rather developing immunity against this virus. And so, in fact, I've been commissioned by both the provincial and federal governments in Canada to develop COVID-19 vaccines. So I do have a preclinical research program that's focused on that. I'm also doing a little bit of research where we're looking at trying to figure out intervention strategies for the overly robust cytokine storms that occur in some people that get infected with this virus.
You know, the way I came upon you, and there's a lot to delve into here, but I came upon your article, and I'll read the title, which kind of gives it away, but you can kind of expand on it. A year of COVID-19 lockdowns is putting kids at risk of allergies, asthma, and autoimmune disease. I mean, what do you mean by that? I mean, from the title.
Yeah, so this is interesting. When the pandemic started, and this is what I realized is, we kept getting told that things were hopefully going to change in the relatively near future. So what happened in Canada, for example, is when Canada declared the pandemic, we were told we were going to go into a 3-week lockdown, and that was to allow our hospitals to prepare and not get overwhelmed with potential cases of severe COVID-19. And then once we so-called flatten the curve, right? This is a term we've been hearing all around the world all the time, flattening the curve. And what we mean by the curve is if you graph the daily cases, right? As the cases ramp up and then decrease, we get these curves. And so the whole idea was, quotes, flatten the curve, which meant stop the increase that was happening early on in the pandemic and the number of daily cases. And the goal was for us to do this for a few weeks, and then we would get out of the lockdowns and that lockdown and learn to live with this virus and without our hospitals at that point being overwhelmed. However, now we're more than a year into this and we're still applying the same strategies. And so I wasn't concerned initially about this issue that you just raised, in this lay article that I wrote. And what it deals with is it's dealing with issues related to the development of our immune systems. And so as you can imagine, I mean, with a 3-week lockdown, for example, there's not a lot of development that goes on in a child's immune system, right? So again, that's why I wasn't concerned. But now that we have isolated our children, severely isolated them from their natural environment and from interactions with other people, I now have substantial concerns about what we've done to our children. And the reason is this. So in a nutshell, when we're born, our immune systems are not fully matured. So many people will be familiar, for example, with the development of the brain and the fact that when we're born, there's all kinds of brain development that occurs after birth. Well, the same is true for many physiological systems, including the immune system. So what happens is when we're born, there's lots of development of the immune system that has to continue well past birth. In fact, our immune systems are not fully matured until well into adolescence. So really, until we're 18 years old, so adults, it's not until that time that we can be quite confident that our immune systems are fully matured. Now, in terms of the development, most of this development of the immune system occurs between birth and 6 years of age. All right, so that's the group that would be most affected. But like I said, because development does continue, there could potentially be progressively less and less impact, harmful impact, on the development of the immune system, but all the way up into adolescence. So even teenagers could be impacted by this, and potentially in a negative way. And what we know as immunologists is there's this scientific principle, and we refer to it as the hygiene hypothesis. Now, this phrase, immunologists, we haven't decided on a new name for this. We would like to change the name from the hygiene hypothesis, simply because it is associated with negative outcomes on the immune system, and we're not trying to say that hygiene in of itself is negative. What we really want to try and achieve is targeted hygiene, right? Meaning hygiene that would help protect us from potential pathogens, so microbes that would cause harm, that would cause disease, but not protect us from the non-harmful microbes that live in our environment, because they are in fact very important for the development of our immune system. So this is the thing. When we're born, our immune systems are completely naive, right? So when we're in our mother's womb, we have not been exposed typically to any kind of microbes. It's a sterile environment. So we don't start encountering the foreign microbial world until we're born. And so these years, especially as I just mentioned, from birth to age 6, these years are absolutely critical for the normal development of the immune system. And one of the very important things that happens during that time is our immune system learns to differentiate between microbes that are dangerous and worth responding to. And among those would be things like SARS coronavirus 2 and influenza virus, et cetera, et cetera. But our immune system also learns about to differentiate those from the non-dangerous microbes that we don't want to be responding to on a constant basis. And so what I mean by that is, you think about it, our bodies are covered inside and out with all kinds of microbes, right? That we use the term our microbiome. And so we often think about bacteria, but we also have billions of viruses that are in and on our body, right? Not all viruses, in fact, it's only a relatively few viruses that cause disease. And you can imagine, and plus we're also constantly exposed to other things that are foreign in our environment, right? So our skin is constantly in contact with various chemicals. We're inhaling dust, pollens, etc. Depending on the time of year, chemicals as well. You know, we sometimes inhale those, and a lot of these things are, the vast majority of these things are very innocuous. And you can imagine if our immune system simply responded to everything that was foreign to the body, we would be in a chronic state of extremely severe inflammation, so severe we wouldn't be able to survive, right? So in order to prevent us from overreacting to things that aren't dangerous, our immune system has to encounter our environment on a regular basis during these critical developmental years. So again, not only our natural environment, but also other people, and literally being exposed to safe microbiomes. So a great example to demonstrate how we know that this is a real scientific principle is that there's two key observations that immunologists have made. One is if you look between different countries. So you look at low-income countries, and if you look at middle-income countries like the United States and Canada. In North America, for example, and other countries like ours, we have declared essentially an epidemic of immunological disorders that are associated with overactive responses and inappropriate responses to things that are not dangerous. And so what these include are allergies, which is when we over-respond, inappropriately respond, again, to things that aren't dangerous, and asthma, and that's similar to the allergies, again, an inappropriate response to something that we inhale that's not dangerous, and also autoimmune diseases, where we actually inappropriately perceive, our immune systems inappropriately perceive cells or molecules within our own body as being dangerous. And so in low-income countries, they have much lower incidence of these diseases than we do in North America. And that's typically associated with the fact that we've, over the past several decades, become overly sanitized in North America, right? So you think about the increase in the use of hand sanitizers and adding antibacterial products to soaps, et cetera, et cetera. Another interesting study is if you look within the country. So if you look within the United States, and you look at children who are raised in rural areas like farms versus those who are raised in large urban centers, there is a very big difference in the incidence of allergies, asthmas, and autoimmune diseases, such that those children who are raised on farms have a much lower incidence on average. And again, this is because those who are raised on farms are in constant contact with the natural environment and the microbial world, right? Whereas those who are growing up in urban centers are growing up in, we could view them as man-made jungles in a sense, right? There's a much more limited exposure to the natural environment. And so this is the issue. Never before in our history, right, in our lifetimes, have we taken children for such a prolonged period of time and kept them so isolated from their natural environment. So you think about it, the kids have been have had minimal engagement with other people, including members of their own families. We have stopped a lot of their activities, right? So sports, outdoor sports, baseball, soccer, football, etc. And we're making them using hand sanitizers, ad nauseum, and we're even filtering the air that they breathe, right? And so this could be a major concern and something that has flown under the radar and has been really underappreciated during this pandemic. My concern is that we may have a generation of COVID kids, and the potential damage we won't be able to fully understand and appreciate until years into the future, right? When these diseases start becoming apparent. But I am afraid that we are going to have, a group of children, especially those that have been in this year-plus long lockdown, that are in that age range of from birth to age 6, who later on in life are going to have not all of them, right? There's genetic predispositions, et cetera, that govern this. So certainly not all of them will develop immunological disorders, but there'll be a much higher incidence, I fear, of immunological disorders. So these kids will grow up and this is irreversible, right? And so we're almost certainly going to have more children that are going to be suffering for the rest of their lives with allergies, asthma, and autoimmune diseases as a consequence of this severe and prolonged lockdown.
Wow. Doctor, this is fascinating. I really appreciate your perspective on this. And I'm a politician, so I'm trying to look to find balance between we fight the virus and balance between trying to help the economy and keep businesses and people employed so we don't have other unintended consequences. It's one of the things, though, I guess, for balance is what we've been told, is if we send our kids back to school or back to environments, and for that 0 to 6 age, I remember my young ones, they went to preschool and they at least 1 or 2 kids there had a runny nose or a cough or something, and they all caught it. And so I can see how your logic applies to, hey, you got to be exposed to this stuff if you want to be able to beat it later in life as well. But the argument has always been, okay, if these kids go to school and grandma and grandpa live in the household, or they go visit grandma and grandpa, then they could potentially spread the disease. So there's kind of a balance. Okay, if we let all the kids, from 0 to 6 go to preschool and everything else, and then what's kind of the balance there, or what's the argument where they're now spreaders as opposed to them potentially having these immunological disorders later in life? What's kind of that balance there, I guess, is keeping them from being spreaders versus saving their own immune system? What's your thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so this, in fact, is the perception. I would say it's largely a misperception that our healthy children could potentially serve as super spreaders. The reality is people who are not showing signs or symptoms of disease likely aren't at much risk. So it was interesting. In Canada, I just saw a study that was published recently where and we're starting this actually, we're starting to do a lot of asymptomatic testing, and we're offering it. It's voluntary for children and teachers at schools. But as this testing is being done, so what they're doing is they're looking for, at healthy individuals, people have no sign of any kind of illness, and then seeing, if they have the virus, the SARS coronavirus 2, if they're infected with it. Now, so first of all, the interesting thing is a tiny minority of people who are asymptomatic and being tested in these scenarios, so again, in the context of a school setting, are testing negative. They don't seem to, there's no evidence of the presence of the virus. And then arguably for those who are positive, the rate at which they are positive doesn't change, that is not significantly different from the false positive rate, because there's some major issues with the testing that can be done for these, especially a lot of the labs have, we use a test that's known as PCR, and it's designed to detect directly the genetic material from this virus, so that if it's found, that means that genetic material had to be in the person. And this is actually an important thing here. So first of all, the test, to try and increase the sensitivity to detect small quantities of this, most labs have increased the number of cycles used. It's a test where you have to run through that incorporates cycles in this. And so a lot of labs, the vast majority of labs have increased the cycle numbers up to very high numbers. And so a consequence of that is we get this sort of artificial increase in the background signal, and this can lead to false positives, right? Where we think we're detecting a signal, but in fact, it's not a true positive. We're not actually detecting real viral genetic material. And the other issue with this is there are scenarios where people will have that genetic material. They'll have the viral genomes or a piece of the viral genome in their body, but it's not, we call replication competent virus particles, meaning they're non-infectious. So a great example, I mean, if somebody's healthy and we get infected with something, and our immune system is able to effectively clear that virus, and certainly among children, this is quite common, where they can readily clear the virus with their immune system rapidly enough that they don't even experience any signs or symptoms of disease, right? And the consequence of the immune system responding is that they will have protection conferred. But what happens, what's interesting is one of the key mechanisms that our immune system uses to get rid of this virus is we have these cells. We have 3 key cell types that are part of our immune system, and they're designed to go, we call them phagocytic cells as immunologists, and the process is called phagocytosis. But what it is, these cells go around the body and they'll gobble up the virus. And once they eat the virus, they'll destroy the virus. But a couple of these cell types are actually designed to hold on to those bits of the virus so that it can activate other parts of the immune system. And these are the things that we're trying to activate when we give the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines. So these would be the T cells. You may have heard about the T cells. And also when people hear about the vaccines, I've been hearing a lot about antibodies that can neutralize the virus. But what this means is these phagocytic cells can actually carry pieces of the virus in the body, and some of them are relatively long-lived. So often with these tests in asymptomatic individuals, what we're actually detecting, yes, we are detecting, if they're true positives, we are detecting the viral genetic material, but it's non-infectious. It's actually trapped in these phagocytic cells, which are being taking this material and using it to activate other components of the immune system. That it's not replication competent viral particles that could infect somebody else and cause disease in somebody else. So as an immunologist, I don't have a lot of concern about that. And this is the issue. But of course, as you mentioned, there's lots of debate, right? So going on right now in the scientific community about this. But the other perspective that I like to bring to this, and I had this affected me really personally just recently. So where my youngest son had a classmate who tested positive for the SARS coronavirus 2. And so immediately our public health unit issued a notice that we had to place our son into what's called, the medical term is isolated quarantine. But the interesting thing is, my wife and I were sitting at the dinner table. We have 2 sons. My older son, who's 15, was also there and listening. We're reading through all these rules. And when we were done, my older son asked the question, why do we have to put Johnny, is the name of my younger son, why do we have to put Johnny into solitary confinement? And I laughed at first and I said, oh, no, solitary confinement is this terrible, consequence for some criminals, right? But then I thought about it and I can actually differentiate the definition. So just to understand, because this plays on the question that Miles asked, right, which is related to the development of the children's immune systems and the isolation. So this is taking the isolation to an extreme. So we were asked, and this felt like, in a sense, as a parent, like I was being asked to essentially abuse my son, because what we were asked to do was for 14 consecutive days, lock him in his room and stay 2 meters away from the rest of the family. And what families in Canada have been doing when receiving this order often is they will, it'll literally be like when you see in a movie with somebody who's been sentenced to be put into solitary confinement, where the parents will open the door, have their child stand back at least 2 meters, and slide their food in on a plate, inside the room, and then close the door. And these are young children. And we actually even had a crazy example where a physician received one of these orders, and again, they were told that they had to physically distance from their child. And again, it was mandated that the child be isolated and eat in a separate room. And there's no accommodations, first of all, for children with special needs, for example. And in this case, there was no accommodation made for the age, because you imagine this child was for 2 weeks to be isolated in a separate room from the parents, including eating in a separate room, as I just mentioned. And this is a 1-year-old child, right? That's not self-sufficient. So, and there have been cases of parents being threatened with $5,000 fines if they don't comply. So this is taking it to an extreme, right? So this is the kind of perspective that I'm taking as a scientist and now as a parent and looking at this, and I've got kids in school, and this is how I view it. This is the reality. As scientists, we can debate potential risk of spread and risk of spread to the older individuals, especially, or immunocompromised individuals, because these are the high risk demographics. But if we think about it from the perspective of children, for children, the statistics now are crystal clear. The SARS coronavirus 2 is no more dangerous for our children than the annual flu. That's just the reality. And in fact, when it comes, because one of the unique things about SARS coronavirus 2 is, in fact, children, especially young children, seem to be particularly resistant to severe disease and potentially lethal disease. So arguably, the annual flu is more dangerous for them. Certainly, there are more deaths in young Americans and young Canadians, very young Americans and Canadians each year from the flu than there has been from the SARS coronavirus 2. So that's one thing, and we certainly don't implement these procedures to protect those children, right? So that's sort of a consequence of our chosen quality of life. But so that just kind of puts in perspective. So from their perspective, I can't differentiate the dangers of SARS coronavirus for them from the dangers that are represented by the annual flu virus for these children. And then you look at it. So with that in mind, in essence, it seems like what we're doing in these debates we're having is we're using our children as shields then for adults. And so I view it this way: as we know the people that are at high risk. SARS coronavirus 2 definitely is much more dangerous for the elderly and people who are immunocompromised. But really, in my opinion, we should then be focusing our protection around these, this relatively limited demographic. And so in essence, I view it as we're dealing with an adult problem, but we're using our children as shields, in the battle against this adult problem. And the children, so, then we can get to the question, is it appropriate to do that with the children, right? They're not at risk from the virus. Certainly all of the isolation policies and masking policies are not healthy for children. I'm not an expert in psychology, for example, but I can guarantee there's mental health issues associated with kids being isolated and having to mask, for example. So that's where I come from, is I'm not worried about them being high-risk spreaders. And again, to be on the safe side, I would say what we need to do is, because it would be a minority of families where very elderly individuals like grandparents are cohabitating with the children. Yes, of course, that there are a lot of families where that is the case, but it's a minority, right? And so again, for the sake of that majority, I think it might be better for us to start thinking about refocusing our resources, both financial and human resources, so that we can better protect the individuals who are at risk. So, for example, if there are grandparents who are living in, right, we help those families find solutions, maybe find alternative, or even if it's temporary, housing somewhere else for them, so they can be relatively isolated from the children should they go back to school if they are genuinely concerned with the potential risk of those children bringing SARS coronavirus 2 back to their home.
All right, thank you. I definitely agree with you that you know, we are potentially using our children as shields as opposed to letting them get on with their lives and develop their own immune systems. One of the things, we're kind of running out of time, but one of the things you said in the beginning was it's really not the goal to get everyone vaccinated. The goal is to get to immunity. So what, I mean, could you kind of expand on that? And then we're going to have to wrap this up. But you said that at the beginning, so I'm just curious, you know, I'm a layman, what does that really mean?
Yeah, so first of all, I should point out, as we're talking about this, so this I should have pointed out when Miles asked me, what is my background, what are my credentials? So before I talk about this, because this overlaps with the vaccine issue, I want to point, within the context of my research program, my entire career has been devoted to the development of vaccines. I develop vaccines both for preventing infectious diseases and treating cancers, actually. And I also teach immunology, and I teach the benefits of vaccines. Although with that said, I would say vaccines that have been well vetted by the scientific community, that have proven to be safe and effective. Now, so this is why I mentioned that the goal here is really immunity. So, because that's what we want to achieve, right? The ultimate goal that every country is trying to achieve is the so-called herd immunity, which is a concept that not everybody needs to be immune to stop the spread of the virus, but most of us have to be immune. And there's two ways to accomplish that. So that's why I say that's the goal, is to acquire immunity among as many people as we can, but that doesn't necessarily equate just with vaccinating everybody, because there's two ways to achieve it. There's the natural acquisition of immunity. So anytime we get infected with a pathogen or a potential pathogen, and that's why I want to say potential pathogen, because in fact, like I said, especially in children, it seems like this isn't even a pathogen with some of them, right? We know that some individuals can get infected and clear that virus and never show signs or symptoms of illness, right? So SARS coronavirus 2 doesn't necessarily equal COVID-19. COVID-19 is a disease. SARS coronavirus 2 is a virus. So in those cases where the people don't even get disease and clear the virus, they're probably mounting natural, immune responses that are clearly very protective against this virus. We also know that those, even if people get sick, for example, with mild and moderate disease, and those with severe disease who recover, will have mounted immune responses against the virus. And the growing body of peer-reviewed, published scientific evidence tells us that these naturally acquired immune responses are long-lived, and they are, so when initially people thought they might be short-lived, but that was based on looking at antibodies. Antibodies are proteins, and they'll disappear from circulation fairly quickly. What confers the purpose of a vaccine and the benefit of having cleared a virus naturally is what we call immunological memory. And these memory cells are long-lasting. And the memory B cells are the ones that can produce antibodies quickly if they ever see the virus again. So it's long-lasting and protects people, so it needs to protect people very well from reinfection. There's been a lot of highly publicized cases globally of people getting reinfected, but in the grand scheme of things, with the millions of people that have been infected, it's an incredibly tiny number of cases that we have documented for reinfection. So it's really not a concern.
One of the problems I guess I'm just kind of seeing with that, with the way I have to deal with things, is we know how many people are getting vaccinated. We don't know how many people have natural acquisition. Is that what you said?
Naturally acquired immunity. Yeah, that we have the exact same problem in Canada. We have been terrible at monitoring this. And what I want to, so this is very important though, because in both countries we're dealing with a real limitation in vaccine doses, right? And trying to figure out who to prioritize delivery of the vaccines to. So this is why I wish we had been monitoring this. So I want to tell you, there's a researcher in British Columbia here in Canada, so located in Vancouver, British Columbia. So for you, this would be just a little bit north of Seattle, Washington. All right, and so they've developed a test. In my opinion, it's the most sensitive and broadly applicable test for evidence of immunity against SARS coronavirus 2. And they just published this study, peer-reviewed paper in a very high-impact scientific journal. And it was very interesting. So they use this because a lot of the tests that we use to look for evidence of immunity looks for antibodies against a spike protein. Now, there's two issues with that. That test tends to not be quite very sensitive, and those antibodies, as I mentioned, tend to disappear fairly quickly. So what this researcher has done is design one that looks at responses against multiple components of the virus. The benefit of it is it can detect responses that last much longer than just the spike-specific protein or antibody response. The other thing is it can differentiate between immunity conferred by the vaccines versus naturally acquired immunity, because not only does it assess immunity to the spike protein, which is what our vaccines are targeting, but also all the other components. And what he found, this is very, very important. This is very important for the issue that you're facing. He randomly tested a large number of adults in our province of British Columbia, apparently healthy adults, and found that between 50 and 60% of them, remarkably, had evidence of naturally acquired immunity to the virus. Now, this is important because if you think about it, like, you're in a better situation we are in Canada. We've bragged that we have, on a per capita basis, the highest number of vaccine doses on order. But in the US right now, you have a higher number in hand than we do in Canada, right? So we're really short. And if that's true, we're trying, as scientists, we're trying to push the Canadian government to start this testing, right? Because if you have two individuals and you test them and one has evidence of naturally acquired immunity, and the data should suggest that that in of itself is going to be quite protective, and the other individual has no evidence of immunity, then the other, instead of quotes wasting the vaccine to the person that's already immune, we should be giving it to the people who aren't. And if it turns out that as few as 40%, maybe to 50% don't have immunity at the moment, right? Then that means we have half as many people that we need to target right now to achieve this herd immunity. And then the big question is, people say, well, how could there be 50 to 60% of people already naturally immune when we've been implementing all these procedures? Well, it's simply because the physical distancing that we've been enacting, the 2 meters, and the masking, I can tell you as a virologist, it just simply is not effective at preventing the spread of this virus. And that's exactly what this data demonstrates, right? I can't emphasize it enough. The virus is 1 micron in diameter. We now know this virus gets out of the lungs through aerosols, which are the fine water particles that come out of the lungs. Those water particles, the very largest ones, will be about 60 microns. So if you have a 60 micron water particle coated with the virus, the maximum diameter is going to be about 62 microns. And now this is very surprising and very important, again, based on published data where people look at all kinds of these, we call them low-cost masks, right? So I use the surgical mask, 3-ply, and of course, maybe we use a cloth mask. Well, a study was done with all kinds of these masks, and it turns out that the pore sizes in these masks, ones that are very tightly woven, the smallest is 80 microns, but the largest pore sizes in these some of these masks is 500 microns. So like I said, so even if you take the smallest pore size, it's 80 microns. These largest water particles covered in the virus are 62 microns. So these things actually don't stop the spread of the virus. Plus, these aerosols can travel up to 30 meters through the air. And if people are wondering what do you mean by these aerosols, right? You and I have glasses. It's like if I want to clean my glasses, what do? I take them off. I exhale on it. I get that nice fogging of the glasses, which gives me that little bit of liquid to clean them, right? That's the aerosol. When I do that, that's the aerosol that's coming out of my lungs. If you go out into the air, and now, depending where you are in the United States, right, throughout all of Canada, we go in the winter time, it's very cold. And when we breathe, we can see our breath. That's the aerosols condensing in the cold air, right? And when you understand this, then you understand that all of this, quotes, physical distancing and mask wearing hasn't been stopping the spread of the virus. And so I would argue in the United States, just like in Canada, you probably have a much higher level of naturally acquired immunity than you would ever appreciate until you actually start doing the testing.
Well, that is a good note to, I think, end on. I appreciate your common sense, your logic, and your layman's. I appreciate it I'm a aviator by, in a career. I was an airline pilot for 33 years. And so this is not up my alley at all, but you explained it in such a way that makes sense. And I think a lot of people agree with. So Miles, you want to kind of wrap it up?
Yeah, well, Doctor, I just appreciate you coming on. And so if people want to learn more, find out, where can they go?
If they look up my name, my name will come up associated with the University of Guelph website, and it has all my contact information. Yeah, people are feel free to call me or email me. And yeah, I do want to emphasize what Jim mentioned there. So indeed, this is a good news message, right? Because when we're trying to achieve this immunity, and everybody's worried about the shortage of vaccines, I think it's very positive. A very good message to understand that we may actually be, because of the year of thinking we were keeping ourselves from spreading the virus among one another, we may actually be much closer to that goal of herd immunity than we ever imagined. And so we might not need to vaccinate as many people as we think in order to reach that goal.
That would be great news. Doctor, I appreciate you coming on and keep up the good work.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity, and take care.